Why did the British adopt the policy of co-opting local colonized elites? Imperial rule, according to Robinson, is only possible to the extent that foreign power is translated into indigenous terms of political economy. The British utilized indirect rule as a form of political control of their distant colonies, ruling through local leaders and the existing pre-colonial hierarchical structures. British colonial officials considered that keeping traditional native power structures and customs would underpin their ability to maintain cohesion and control. Co-opting the local elites and the existing social structures of their colonies enabled the British to more easily protect their strategic interests from their European rivals, as well as more effectively combat native resistance. For the ruling collaborators, the British could provide an alternative source of economic power to protect their own interests and agendas. In this presentation, I will be focusing on the examples of the British co-option of ruling elites in India and Malaya, respectively. The British rule in India would first begin with the East India Company. The East India Company, also known as the EIC, was a monopolistic mercantile company formed in 1600 for trade in the East Indies, and became an important instrument of British imperialism. The EIC's charter allowed it to directly negotiate with local rulers, create courts, and impose laws, as well as engage in warfare to defend its interests. Indirect rule was initially a device for the EIC to protect and administrate its interests, but in the 19th century evolved into a doctrine of imperial governance. In its treaties with ruling princes, the company sought to maximize commercial profits, limit political liabilities, and reduce operational expenses through maintenance of existing administration. The company's empire building in India was attained through treaties to sanction military conquests, formalize commercial alliances, and impose payments from Indian rulers, eventually constructing a system of British imperial paramountcy over the princely states of India. The prince's cooperation was given to the British in order to maintain their wealth, privileges, and the continuation of their rule over their subjects, while the British in turn secured legitimacy in their own control over Indian politics and the protection of their own economic and political interests. To ensure the cooperation of the Indian princes, the EIC posted its own agents, also known as residents, in each of the princely courts to act as advisors, but also to provide reports and records of the goings-on at court to the company. Increasingly, as the residents began to incorporate more diplomatic functions in their advisory roles, they would soon begin to undermine the authority of the princes as they began to take on more functions at court. EIC, over time, would effectively go from being simply a trade company to functionally being another ruling polity within the network of princely states of the Indian subcontinent. The Treaty of Allahabad in 1765 with the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II granted the EIC the right to collect revenues from the provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, as well as to administer civil justice. In return for these rights, the EIC was to make an annual tribute to the emperor. Negotiation for military alliance with Indian rulers was a key strategy as the Anglo-French rivalry for dominance in the Indian Ocean intensified. The company organized its territories into three presidencies and established its own standing armies for each. These were stationed in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. From this point, the EIC utilized Indian troops under the command of British officers. Under the guise of maintaining alliances, princes were required to contribute financially toward subsidiary contingents Through the requirement for subsidiary payments, the British limited the ability of Indian rulers to maintain their own defences. These subsidiary contingents were increasingly reserved by the British to achieve their own strategic goals. By the 1820s, the British, through the EIC, controlled one of the largest standing armies, which was funded by Indian rulers. The differing arrangements by the British in India at the start of the 19th century with local elites, and the use of military control to annex smaller states while imposing alliances on the stronger states ensured the acceptance of new treaties as the British penetrated their way further into the internal politics of the Indian subcontinent. The Indian model of indirect rule through treaties with subordinate allies was extended by the British to its treaties with the sultanates of Malaya. These collaborative efforts usually involve the British aiding Malay sultans in cementing their administrative and dynastic power in return for land grants, for plantation agriculture, and the establishment of trading outposts for the EIC. Britain expanded its hold on commercial shipping routes through the EIC, securing the ports of Singapore, Penang, and Malacca in 1826. Each of these port jurisdictions In each of these port jurisdictions, the negotiations and the strategies for control were individualized, but a single administrative entity, the Strait Settlements, was established as a fourth presidency of India to better control the other polities in the region. In Penang, the EIC built an imperial presence by introducing English forms of law and policy. In this way, they followed what they believed to be the most legitimate route to establish a regional governance regime in the Straits of Malacca that mimicked the EIC in Bengal. EIC officials in Penang delegated legal authority to local leaders and established close relationships with local merchants. The Malay Peninsula was comprised of multiple minor states and fiefdoms ruled by sultans and other local chiefs. Britain strengthened its economic dominance over the Malay Peninsula by collaborating with these local rulers. The Pankor Treaty of 1874, with the sultans of the protected Malay states, accepted the installation of British residents, as had been the case in India. These agreements affirmed the sovereignty of Malay rulers while obliging them to follow the advice of the British residents in all matters of state, apart from those that related to religion or cultural matters. British colonials encouraged the cultural regalia and pomp of the ruling sultans in their displays of prestige as a means of reinforcing the established hierarchy and social order, and thus reinforcing their own control over Malayan politics. Furthermore, the British used education to funnel Malayan elites into the colonial administration system. By adopting a divide and rule education policy, only traditional Malayan ruling elites were educated in English to a secondary level. This system was also aimed to limit the social mobility of rural workers to maintain a status quo in Malay class division and to avoid popular resistance to British rule. The British facilitated the migration of Indian and Chinese workers to work in the tin mines and rubber plantations, but ensured that only native Malays could work in colonial administration. And similarly, only native Malays had the rights of land ownership for rice cultivation. The British co-opted local rulers to more effectively control their foreign dependencies and to secure strategic allies to protect their interests against competing European powers. Co-opting ruling elites was a means to establish legitimacy of British rule and exercise its colonial power. This involved the establishment of a mutually beneficial relationship in which local rulers, in exchange for ceding control over foreign policy and economic matters of state to the management of British advisers, would have their legitimacy and the security of their regimes safeguarded. The India model of indirect rule and co-opting ruler elites was core to the expansion of the British Empire as imperial administrators and politicians sought to minimize the economic and political costs of direct annexation.